Hey guys, my name is Max and welcome to Simple Biology. In this video, we're going to start talking about biomolecules. Now, throughout this unit, we'll be talking about these biomolecules, and they're really very important toward biology. Biomolecules form the basis of everything we're going to be studying in biology, from cells to ecosystems. If you boil it all down to the most fundamental level, those biomolecules will be there, and so that's why we're going to be studying them. So first off, what is a biomolecule? Why are we even bothering with this, and what does this mean? Essentially, biomolecules are organic compounds that are important for life. Now, of course, there's two parts to this statement. First of all, organic compounds. An organic compound is essentially any compound that has carbon in it, and almost all the times it'll also have hydrogen in it, as well as some other elements that we'll be talking about in just a minute. And so from there, you can tell that all biomolecules will have carbon, and carbon will be very important to their structure. That'll be like the foundation of those molecules. For example, you might have methane, which is CH4, and as you can see from this diagram, everything is based on that carbon. Now, in addition to methane, you can have many other what we call hydrocarbons, and these are all also based on carbon. And hydrogen, like I said, hydrogen is also going to be there in most biomolecules. But you can see that carbon is the backbone. It's the essential element for these biomolecules. It's the center of those biomolecules. And now, like I said, there's two parts to this. You also have that they're important to life. So that means we're going to get some pretty specific biomolecules, and all that have very specific functions that play roles in the human body, in the bodies of all living organisms. And so, as we'll see as we go back to this PowerPoint throughout this unit, you'll see that each of these biomolecules has variations in their structure that are important to their function, and that function is to support life. Now also, like I mentioned, they all contain carbon and hydrogen. The hydrogen is just there really to fill in the gaps. So they all contain these two, and they also contain they contain many other elements, but some of the most important that we're going to be talking about are oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. You're going to want to remember these because it'll be very important. It'll come up many times. We'll be coming back to this in a couple slides. So next thing we're going to talk about are the different types of biomolecules. And really this slide comes from the fact that biologists like to classify things. I don't know what it is, but they like to break it down. I guess it makes it simpler. But we have 4 different types of biomolecules that we're going to categorize everything into. The first we have is carbohydrates. Now, the word carbohydrate basically means watery carbon mixed with water, and this comes from the fact that carbohydrates have hydrogen and oxygen in a 2-to-1 ratio, just like water does. 2 to 1. I wrote 0. 2 to 1. 2 to 1 ratio, just like water does. If you know the chemical formula for water is H2O. It's that same ratio. So that's where the hydrate comes from, water. Some of the examples of this are the sugar that you eat, starch, like in potatoes, or even the cellulose that you get in wood. The next type of biomolecules is lipids, and lipids are categorized as any biomolecule really that is nonpolar and hydrophobic. So that's your oil, your wax, your grease, and this is important to life because lipids make up most of the biological membranes that we see, like the cell membranes and stuff like that, as well as several specific types of hormones in your body that are there to transmit messages between different cells. And so these lipids do play a very important role in your body. They're also stored for various other functions, but those are just 2 examples. Next, we have proteins, and really any biomolecule that needs a specific shape will be a protein, whether it's the keratin in your hair and in your fingernails, or it's enzymes that are used to catalyze the reactions in your cells in very specific places. Any biomolecule that needs to have a specific shape will get that shape because it's a protein. And we have a video on proteins. We have a video on all of these, but we have a video on proteins that will go more into why the shape is so important for a protein and how that happens. The last type of biomolecules that we're going to talk about is nucleic acids. And nucleic acids are a very specific type of biomolecule, and they're used to store and use genetic information. Genetic information is just the information passed down in the structure of the biomolecules from your parents down to you, And if you've heard of DNA, that's the best example of a nucleic acid, the most familiar example. And that's where that genetic information is actually stored. So anything with genetic information is going to be in these nucleic acids. But what do each of these biomolecules contain? Why? How do we put this information that we've gotten together today? How do we put this information all together? So each of these four types actually all contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Notice that not all biomolecules contain oxygen, but the four main types do. Sometimes you have hydrocarbons like the one I showed you on the first slide that won't have oxygen, but anything that's a carbohydrate, lipid, protein, or nucleic acid will have some amount of oxygen. Now, carbohydrates have a lot of oxygen. They have the most oxygen out of the four. That 2-to-1 ratio that I showed, I'm going to write that again. That 2-to-1 ratio is one way to identify these carbohydrates. They just have a tremendous amount of oxygen, which it doesn't seem like that because one oxygen for every two hydrogens, but this is actually a lot for biomolecules. Next, we have lipids, and they contain a lot less oxygen. So you can identify those lipids because it's more of the carbon and the hydrogen rather than the oxygen. And an interesting thing about lipids is that some of them actually contain phosphorus, and these we call them phospholipids. These phospholipids are found in your membranes, and we'll talk more about those, the function of phospholipids later on in a couple different videos throughout our units. But some lipids do contain phosphorus. That's sometimes helpful to know. Next, we have proteins, and the important thing to note about proteins is that they contain two elements that are not found in all biomolecules. This nitrogen and sulfur. I'm going to circle sulfur because it's it's very important, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. And this sulfur plays a very significant role in proteins and their structure, which we'll talk about in our proteins videos. But the last biomolecule, of course, nucleic acids, it is distinguished because it also contains two elements that not all biomolecules do. Again, nitrogen and phosphorus. Every nucleic acid will have a significant amount of phosphorus. Now, the reason I circled these two elements, for sulfur for proteins and phosphorus for nucleic acids, is because these are the elements that are very unique. Proteins are the only biomolecules that have any amount of sulfur at all, besides some very specific biomolecules that aren't really classified into any of these four. But proteins are the only biomolecules of these four groups that contain a significant amount of sulfur. Now, nucleic acids are the only biomolecules of these four groups that have a significant amount of phosphorus, and more importantly, that always have phosphorus. Like I said, lipids do sometimes have phosphorus, but it's just a little bit, and it's only very specific types of lipids. So these two elements, this sulfur and this phosphorus, can be instantly used to identify and distinguish proteins and nucleic acids. For carbohydrates and lipids, it's the absence of sulfur and phosphorus, and then whether or not they have the 2-to-1 ratio to distinguish between those. But this is how you can kind of distinguish between the different biomolecules by what they contain. I hope that made sense, and biomolecules is really just as simple as that.